Welcome to this broadcast live from New York, which is linked to the Lovenbroek project of the Art Basel online viewing room. First, I would like to thank the Lovenbroek Gallery for organizing this talk about Jean Dupuy's Lazy Art, the title of the artist's solo show by the Lovenbroek Gallery at Art Basel. My name is Christian Xatrec. I'm an artist and a curator. Joining me is Julia Robinson. Hello, Julia.
Hello.
Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at New York University. Julia is also a curator and has written extensively on Marcel Duchamp, John Cage, George Brecht, Fluxus, and more broadly on the experimental art of the 60s. So, Julia.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to quickly say something about the format of today's talk, which will be about 30 to 40 minutes. And how we're going to do it is Christian's going to present some of the relevant works and talk us through how they developed and you know, tell us more details about them. And then I'm going to speak we'll both speak about 10 minutes, and I'll speak a little bit about the historical relations of this work to particularly to Jean Dupuy, to Jean and Duchamp, referring to an exhibition that the Lovenbroek Gallery did in 2017, where they discussed the affinities of these two artists, which seems specifically to refer to the piece in Art Basel under the title of Lazy Art Printing Table. So, and at the end of this time, Christian and I will have a little bit of a conversation about some of the topics that have come up as we've been speaking. So welcome, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to being with you for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Thanks.
Laziness. Laziness is disinclination to activity or exertion, despite having the ability to act or to exert oneself. Laziness, sloth, is one of the 7 deadly sins in Christian teachings, and the term is used as a pejorative in most other religions, as in both capitalist and socialist doctrines. I would like to mention 3 significant historical references which addresses the theme of laziness in a different vein. So first, Paul Lafargue, 1880, political pamphlet, The Right to be Lazy, which expounds the ethics of the capitalist class at the beginning of the 19th century. In Lafargue's own words, capitalist ethics is a pitiful parody on Christian ethics. Its ideal is to reduce the producer of the smallest number of needs, to suppress his joys and his passions, and to condemn him to play the part of a machine turning out work without respite and without thanks. Ksenia Maravich's more mystical text, Laziness, The Real Truth About Mankind, 1921, which can be best summed up by the artist's introductory sentence, I quote Maravich, "In this brief note, I want to remove the brand of shame from laziness and to pronounce it not the mother of all vices, but the mother of perfection," end of quote. And last but not least, the most eloquent and radical praise of laziness, before Dupuy, perhaps, epitomized in the life and work of Marcel Duchamp, who once said, John Cage boasts of having introduced silence into music. I'm proud of having celebrated the laziness in art. While Duchamp described his life's work as merely that of a respirateur, Dupuy speaks of his own as a pastime, in the sense of an activity done for enjoyment rather than work. Dupuy acknowledges the 1960 exhibition of the Greek artist Thanos Tsingos at the Quatre Saisons gallery in Paris in 1960, yes, as being at the origin of what he later called lazy art, an idea, a strategy, which he has used and developed throughout his work ever since. In the index of 1-2, his first published artist book in 1981, Dupuy describes lazy art as, I quote, an art which consists of having the work done by a tool or by others, end of quote. So the works we will now see exemplify, and I will describe them lightly, will exemplify this discussion.
Can we see your screen? Yeah.
Yeah, share screen. Okay, and voilà. Okay, here we are. I'm sorry, I'm still not fluent with this medium. Cone pyramid, also Hard Beats Dust, 1968. First shown in Pontus Sultan Machine Show at MoMA, New York in 1968, is Jean Dupuy's earliest lazy artwork. It is also the first work of his art and technology period, which he ended in 1972, the year he quit the Solaben Gallery. In Cone Pyramid, it is the spectators who activate the machine. Their heartbeats recorded with a stethoscope placed on her hearts are electronically amplified through a speaker hidden underneath a square latex membrane, setting in motion a low-density red pigment spread on the membrane. Through a glass pane, one can see in the beam of the light projector a red dust sculpture in the singular shape of a conical figure morphing into a pyramidal one. So we are going to see this So, like a bachelor machine, like a bachelor machine, a term coined by Marcel Duchamp in reference to the lower half of his large glass, and a theme later developed by Michel Carouge, cone pyramid operates in a closed circuit. Here, the pigment, the dust, set in motion in the light beam by the action of the public, becomes the ephemeral matter of the sculpture, which it reveals. In the 70s, Dupuy realized a number of lazy art pieces, including two iconic ones, Lazy Art Pencil and Lazy Art New York Telephone Book. Lazy Art Pencil, which we look at now, consists of an horizontal graphite trace stretched between the two halves of a pencil split lengthwise. However, the eraser has been kept whole and extrudes from the surface of the paper, forcing the graphite trace to lazily follow the edge of the paper. The second one, Lazy Art New York Telephone Book, one of Dupuy's most minimal work, also conceptually the closest perhaps to a rectified ready-made. Julia will address that later. Is a page from the New York Telephone Book from which Dupuy cut out a rectangle with his name, address, and phone number, and pasted it, we can see it at the bottom of the page. As a signature, Sagittarius, 1974, relates to the two previous works shown. It is a Lazy Art Pencil as well as, quote unquote, a signature work. Sagittarius is also a theme dear to Dupuy, born Sagittarius on November 22. And this accounts certainly for the numerous occurrence of the arrow in different forms and formats throughout his work. All those arrows, including the one we look at, appears as if frozen in their own space-time and point out to a direction out of the field. hors du champ, one would say in French, as if hinting at their own exit. Printing table 1974 is an optical construction where viewers are invited to look through the lens of a periscope, which emerges from a white sheet of paper that lies flat on a table facing a mirror. Peering through the periscope, the viewers are surprised to see themselves looking at themselves through the lens. But there is more. While so doing, unbeknownst to them and literally with the sweat of their brow, they are participating in the making of a quote-unquote collective print. Seen here on the left of the screen is a golden print resulting from the accumulated traces of some 5,000 foreheads and noses, Dupuy's estimate of the number of viewers it takes to produce one print. Collective performance. Performance as an art genre appeared in New York at the beginning of the 70s in reaction to the powerful rise of the art market and its influence on art institutions. In his second collective exhibition titled About 405 East 13th Street 2, 1974, Dupuy realizes his first performance, The Shaving of My Mustache, on a homemade revolving stage, also called the Lazy Suzanne. The same year, he organized at the Kitchen, New York, his first collective performance concert, the now famous Soup and Tart, to which he invites 38 artists, among whom Philip Glass, Jana Hampson, Laurie Anderson, John Jonas, Gordon Meta-Clark, Hannah Wilkes, Sylvia Whitman, Richard Serra. Between 74 and 77, Dupuy produced a dozen collective performance concerts conceived around a theme which invited artists are asked to address. These themes became the title of concert, like One Sunday Afternoon on a Revolving Stage, Whitney Museum, New York, 76, Grommets, PS1, New York, 76, and Art Performance Minute, 78, at the Louvre Museum. Although Dupuy long denied it, his concept of collective performance is closely connected to that of lazy art, in that all those events which he titles and produces are in fact collectively realized by his artist guests. Richard Serra might have been the only one actually who understood that. Sure, I will build your material, he responded when Dupuy invited him to perform in a Soup and Tart. Lazy Suzanne, 1979, is a monumental sculpture which marks the end of the collective performance period for Dupuy. The work is an assemblage of two large-sized props, the revolving stage, the Lazy Suzanne, used during Dupuy's first performance, The Shaving of My Mustache, and the two lateral ladders of the tower from the concert, The Tower at PS1 in 1977. The revolving stage, that we see, originally activated by hand, has been blocked by a padlock which prevents its rotation and is now following the kinetic movement responsible for the rotation of the Earth. Lazy Suzanne has become the universal stage, a meta machine gravitating lazily at the rate of one revolution a day. Finally, it is impossible not to mention Dupuy's anagrammatic work. For one of the main principles of the anagram, which links it to the idea of lazy art, is not so much that the anagram generates sense, but that it perceives sense where it already exists, somewhere, anywhere in the universe of the everyday life. The anagram is the axiom that Jean Dupuy chose to elaborate empirically a self-organizer system which allowed him to structure and synthesize his entire œuvre. His anagrammatic work, which fills more than 30 volumes dating from 1985 to the present, represent his final and unexpected illumination of his own version of lazy art. I stopped sharing and now we are back, I guess. Oh, wow, that's good, it works. So Julia, you might want to take over and give us your input.
Okay. Just trying to share my screen. Share. Do you have the PowerPoint?
Yep, you can see it.
Okay. All right. So Duchamp, deep down, I'm enormously lazy, Marcel Duchamp once said. We do not believe Duchamp just as much as we do not believe Dupuy, if we take lazy at face value. But since both artists used language as a surgical instrument, as much as a palette, we must take their word choice seriously. This forces us to think. Indeed, it forces us to become involved in the artist's thought process. Neither Duchamp nor Dupuy give us the choice that a great deal of art does, to be passive observers. The ratio of input and output on both sides has changed. We're confronted by a new system, new measures and variables, a new scale. So it seems worthwhile to pause for a moment and to try to track the operations that got us here. On the subject of definitions, in a discussion at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961, Duchamp was asked if he really meant to destroy art. His answer was only for himself. Clear to us today is that Duchamp's project was not one of destruction, but deconstruction. The task he set himself meant remaining acutely conscious of the system into which art is invoked, the function of the artist's position, and the role of the spectator, all of which he understood were moving perpetually in dynamic interrelation. The continuing significance of Duchamp's project and the significance it has for Dupuy results from this concern never to settle for a static definition of artistic practice, to challenge all frames of reference, all systems of value, and perhaps most importantly, in Duchamp's favorite game of chess, to anticipate new contexts and constellations that surround one's every move, altering the stakes of the game over and over again. So why would Duchamp and Dupuy identify with laziness? Why would Dupuy choose the term lazy art? Both are understood as deeply disciplined artists, knowing for having never stopped working. Dupuy at 95 still makes art every day. So lazy seems to be a value judgment, which suggests just the opposite. If we take the ready-made as a catalyst, which forever changed the definition of art itself, we must admit that Duchamp demonstrated there the quotient of the artist's input as near to zero as he could get it. With this, he simply moved the meaning and the value to another place. To have this system work, he inaugurated a strategy of nominalism, naming his object or his aim, changing the address. Suddenly the ball was in our court. It forced us to pay attention to what the artist said as much as what he did, to turn our minds to what had been distinguished and designated as the conceptual basis of the work. So speaking of laziness then, this very speaking of laziness was a way to recalibrate authorship, redistribute the action of calculation, to have us think in a different way about the artist's activity and what is or is not produced. So when Dupuy designated the series of work lazy art, we should not take this to mean the lack of accomplishment that we normally associate with that word. Instead, we instantly become curious about what that relative term does to the art so designated, how it could possibly work, no pun intended. When Duchamp said the spectator completes the work in his 1957 lecture on the creative act, this was not just another vector of dandyish, lazy art. It was a statement of fact, meant as a gentle censure to the delusions of egomaniac artists. This was about the moment Dupuy was emerging as an artist himself, landing in a sea of expressive abstraction and thinking about how and whether he could keep up painting as usual. Like Duchamp, Dupuy jumped ship and headed for New York. So there is this image that I begin with on the right. You know what's on the left, a very relaxed Duchamp with his cigar. On the right, Dupuy lying in a hammock that he'd strung up in his New York loft, swaying around, a hat propped on his head, slanted forward slightly, as if providing shade for a little snooze. In one use of this archival film, the chilled out artist tells the story of the evolution of his most infamous work, Heartbeats Dust of 1968, which Christian just discussed. It is an accumulation of accidents and coincidences, the artist explained. Now, Christian just also noted that Duchamp called himself a respirateur, someone who simply breathes. Dupuy, I think, carried this into the realm of the spectator when he made each person's heartbeat the animator of his sculpture. I'm just showing you Duchamp's first ideas about dust, and the idea of, he had this note in the green box about raising dust. I think it perfectly evokes the transition from the passive dust in Duchamp's Dust on the Large Glass to the raising dust and the energy behind the Dupuy work. Now, by way of comparison, I just wanted to briefly speak about a work called An Environment by Robert Morris that is now known actually with a different name, Passageway, from 1961. It was a corridor that began as wide as a large doorway of a classic New York loft. This one belonging to Yoko Ono, well before she became a household name. Morris built this sculptural space, creating for the spectator a circular path which narrows, narrows as it progresses. As the walls closed in, tightening the frame around the body, the viewer not only felt the pressure of the diminishing space, but experienced this against a din of heartbeats. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. This sound aspect of that piece, which has been lost when we call it the first work of minimal art, as many people do, was part of something, an experiment that was unclassifiable, as most of the very interesting experimental work was at the time. It was Morris's contribution to a concert series that in 1960-61 that the composer Lamont Young had organized. This was an early manifestation of the post-Cagean activity involving a new generation who no longer separated themselves as artists, musicians, poets, and dancers. Performance, the use of real time, brought them all together in a seamless collaboration. This cross-section of talent, which paved the way for Fluxus, at least its New York contingent, included many artists with whom Dupuy would become very much involved, when he likewise realized the value of performance as what he called a collective consciousness. So we might in fact see Dupuy's role in organizing these ambitious, dense programs as another instance of lazy art. It has precisely that combination of complexity and laissez-faire that seems to best characterize the concept. Setting up the structure and then seeing how the art plays out without you. Those hectic evenings of piece after piece, like so many drafts, allowed art to be far more exploratory, experimental, precarious. As Christian mentioned, Richard Serra was suspicious of this organization, and he accused Dupuy of just making him his material. The beauty of it was that any material was everyone's. Like the indeterminacy that entered Fluxus, it was not something that could be unilaterally possessed. In this sense, Dupuy, like Machunas, followed Cage's ethos that our poetry now is the realization that we possess nothing. Anything, therefore, is a delight. The key Cagean concept of indeterminacy, which had absorbed Duchamp's idea that the spectator completes the work, was translated in Fluxus by what George Brecht had earlier called situation participation. In the way Dupuy's work works, in particular his concept of lazy art, has to do with this kind of porosity, an openness to an unnameable and unquantifiable resources of future energy. The energy drawn from wherever the work is and whoever is on the spot to engage it. This is composition that composes with reality, acknowledging, as Dupuy's friend Robert Filliou put it, art is what makes life more interesting than art. For Filliou, Brecht, Machunas, and many other of Dupuy's peers, Cage was always regularly cited as a reference, but just as importantly, Duchamp was too. So it seems apt that we would end where we began, with affinities in this activity that was anything but lazy. So I'm just showing you a slide just to sort of speak briefly about points of view and the viewer and circumscribing the viewer's activity as deep thought that goes well into the work before there's any kind of regular, what we think of as spectatorship. So on the left, you have the entrance of Marcel Duchamp's Étang Donné in the Philadelphia Museum. And you see a visitor looking through this small hole that he made available. And when they put their face down, they make an imprint of their head, maybe their hand, their presence. On the right, you see an image of the Grommet Gallery and performances that Dupuy organized in the 60s and 70s with the audience climbing up ladders, moving around, not in a standard audience position, but sort of leaning and looking at the work in the way that Dupuy very much had planned. So I'm going to talk about briefly about this work and the Small Glass of 1918 by Duchamp, a preparatory study to the Large Glass. In the center, you'll see a lens, and there's a horizontal bar across the middle that says, in English, to be looked at close to, from the other side of the glass, close to, with one eye for almost an hour. Sorry, went too fast. All right, so let's see. Dupuy took up from Duchamp this one crucial device of energy, energy conservation that Dupuy took up from Duchamp, extended that ever-present machine of ready-made indeterminacy that we call language. Another inextricable from the latter, again, is this role of the spectator with the artist in the use of language. In this, we can trace a line from Heartbeat's Dust through the performance work, the anagrammatic paintings, and the diverse three-dimensional pieces Dupuy has made up until the present. Now that work sometimes relies on instructions and other times the prompt is simply implied. Duchamp's small glass is arguably the 20th century's first instruction piece that so positioned the spectator. Speaking of its big brother, the large glass, Duchamp emphasized that it should be thought of as not as painting, but as a delay. If a delay is an index through time, as sound follows light, Duchamp carried indexicality through to the language of printing and the photographic. And that's really what we see realized in the work of the printing table of Dupuy that you'll see in the present exhibition at Basel. So with all these elements, we have this ideal reading of the printing table. The spectator is positioned in their looking to complete the work with the index of them having been there, the print on that paper that has delayed them. Dupuy, and what I'm showing you now is just an image of the large glass. And then on the right, the installation at Lovenbroek in 2017, it's quite hard to make out, but the large glass was installed in the Paris Gallery. And what you see through it is a pedestal with a glass of red wine that is Dupuy's pendant installation in that exhibition. So I just want to close with the comment that Dupuy gave Duchamp a knowing nod to all of this in his exhibition at Lovenbroek that I had mentioned at the start. One which illuminated the affinity between the two artists. He raised a small glass before that big brother, as if to make a toast to the coincidences that make life interesting. Thank you very much. So Christian, we should bring out some of the issues. Do you have any questions?
What's called le petit rouge.
Oh, yes. So, beg your pardon. So Petit Rouge and Grand Vert is the beautiful play on words that Dupuy constructed.
Yeah, and that was a great homage. You're right. And, I mean, homage and you know,
dialogue.
Yeah. Yes.
So with the printing table, you've seen it installed many times, and do you think is the reaction of people when they come up to the work and try to understand what the artist's position was in making it and participate or don't in the making of the work?
Well, I mean, there's the physical, I mean, you're right. I mean, the physical experience of it, one's own. And I remember my first experience, once you know about the optical device, which, you know, what's happening there optically, you see it in a different vein. But when you discover it first, you just simply look at the viewer looks at in this lens and sees the back of his head. I mean, basically, which Jean said he offers the viewer the view of the back of his head. Obviously, it's much more than that in the sense that it's a real. It probably could and it can produce a sensation of unbalance because you don't understand how is it possible in the first place. You don't expect.
And that makes me think of something that you've said before about Dupuy being very ecological about the way he makes his work. So in a sense, that the face of the viewer is kind of like a snapshot in the Duchampian sense, this snapshot, this delay. He takes a picture and gains this imprint. And there's always this sort of ecological process of part of Dupuy's work working once the viewer's engaged. And I think you beautifully discussed that in terms of the structure of the anagrams in relation to the machine that grinds its own chocolate in the bottom of the large glass.
Yeah,
the bachelor machine.
That was a discussion we recently had. It's about the relation formally. I mean, it's a formal I mentioned very briefly, of course, we have half an hour or 35 minutes or 40 minutes to speak about it. But the anagram is a composite of the anagrammatic painting, Jean's anagrammatic paintings are always composed with in two parts, an upper part and a lower part with a space in between. And if you look at the Grand Verre, so it's basically, and I named those, or I thought of those paintings as a bachelor machine, like the Grand Verre will be. And what we discussed was the vision I had of imagining visually of the Grand Verre and the anagrammatic painting with this half line, these two parts. And it's very striking because the paintings are very large. Jean Dupuy's anagrammatic painting are very large, scale pretty much of the Grand Verre. And there is, it had been discussed, called a guillotine. I'm talking about Duchamp's Grand Verre at time, but it has this double part, which is visually very, and which, as you mentioned, is including the idea of delay. And I think you're better, you can better talk about delay and where does delay in Duchampian term function in the Grand Verre and in the anagram.
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, Duchamp didn't want to call the large glass a painting. And the one thing that stops Dupuy's anagrams being simply paintings is the act of reading, right? So the reading is this sort of, aesthetic anti-retinal in a way. And yet the palette of the letters is so kaleidoscopically retinal that he creates this exquisite paradox between the anti-retinal of reading and the impossible to avoid retinal of this extraordinary color scheme. But in a way, the color as language somehow sort of feeds the machine of the way that the two structures operate and cause the thinking in the viewer, right? They're not the colors of art, they're the colors of food and all kinds of other things that keep disrupting the term of art.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I would, that's really beautifully expressed. I like to go back to the idea of inframince, inframince in Duchamp's, in inframince, the idea of inframince. About, I don't know if I heard you applying it in relation to the printing table and the way the print is.
So most people will know this, but Duchamp had these wonderful discussions that, definitions that really apply actually to Dupuy's lazy art of things that just change state or happen without you doing anything, right? Without anyone doing anything. So he had one definition was the difference that the space taken up by a pressed clean white shirt or a dirty shirt, right? That's the inframince. Or the difference between a razor, brand new, or once it's sort of blunted a little bit on its own, right? So I think that this sort of printing of the skin is this minimal trace. So it's tracing, the drawing table conjures tracing, drawing, the history of the medium of drawing from the Renaissance onwards with the lens devices, the kind of quasi-camera obscura structure, like old-fashioned ways of drawing. And then he's like, look, no hands, and the person makes their own print. So it's an incredible reference to the photographic process, the spectator leaving a trace, a signature. Our print of our skin is a signature. No one else has the same print. So in all these inframince ways, Dupuy has sort of made this liminal trace of spectatorial participation in this piece.
Okay, if you wanted to, we have the time.
We have like 1 minute or two, I think.
1 minute. If you would like to compare in a few words or to liken Duchamp's brand of lazy art and Dupuy's, is there anything you could say that you would like to say to differentiate them or to bring them together?
Well, one thing I would like to just probably end with is to speak about language as a system, because that it's a very deceptive form of laziness in the most complex sense that I've discussed it in Dupuy, in the sense that just like the ready-made is something we recognize and we say, I know what that is, language, unlike centuries of painting, is accessible. We all use it every day, right? So somehow, as rich and complex as Dupuy's anagrams are, his system, this incredible system that he developed, he made it in a system that we all use. So this is our access to that work, and it'll never go away unless the language changes, which it's unlikely to do. So he made this permanent nexus into the future by using this sort of matrix of language. I think that's probably all I have to say, but if you wanted to make...
No. I think I will let you, if you feel. Conclude.
I think finally, we might just want to give a salute to Jean.
Yes, I know that I understand that he's watching. So Jean...
Jean, we're very happy to be here for you and to be speaking about your work. We admire you greatly.
Yeah, Jean is right now, we might want to, since we mentioned him being present, he's right now looking at this from Pierrefeu, his village in Arrière-Pays Niçois, back of mountain of Nice. And again, we are sorry to not to have him here with us, but we really
He's very much here with us in every other way. And we hope that you'll look at the work on the viewing room in the exhibit in Basel, and come to it with a lot more of a sense about it now that we've spoken about it a little bit at length. Thank you very much for attending and watching this, and enjoy Dupuy's printing table and the other work of the Lovenbroek installation. Thanks.
Bye-bye to everyone.